The oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling as the plane tilted sharply. Passengers screamed, while flight attendant Amber Wilson stood frozen, her face pale with terror as she stared at Derek Johnson. Blood trickled from his lip as he calmly said, "Now you understand what it feels like when someone can't breathe." Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination on public transportation, and subscribe to join our community fighting for justice. Trust me, what happens next in this story will change how you see airline travel forever. 8-year-old Zion Johnson clutched his Spider-Man backpack against his chest, eyes wide as he watched the hustle of Nashville International Airport. Today marked his first solo flight to visit his grandparents in Denver, and despite his outward confidence, his heartbeat hammered against his ribs. Remember what we talked about, his father asked, kneeling to eye level. Isaiah Johnson, at 6'2", with broad shoulders and the disciplined posture that came from 15 years as a Navy SEAL, somehow managed to look gentle as he adjusted his son's collar. "Yes, sir," Zion nodded solemnly. "Be respectful to everyone. Follow all instructions. Keep my boarding pass and ID in the front pocket. Don't talk to strangers unless they're airline staff." Isaiah smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "And if anything makes you uncomfortable, call you immediately from the plane phone," Zion recited. "And remember that I'm a Johnson & Johnson's. Conduct themselves with dignity no matter what." Isaiah pulled his son into a tight hug, inhaling the scent of his son's coconut shampoo. After losing his wife Maria to cancer 2 years ago, Zion had become his entire world. This trip had been Zion's idea. The boy wanted to prove he was growing up could handle responsibility. Isaiah reluctantly agreed, using his military connections to arrange special monitoring for his son's journey. "Your grandparents will be waiting the minute you step off the plane," Isaiah assured him. "And I'll be there to pick you up in 3 days." As they approached the check-in counter, Isaiah noticed the slight change in the attendant's demeanor, the flash of wariness he'd grown accustomed to seeing when people realized the well-dressed black man and child were traveling together. He'd learned to ignore these microaggressions, focusing instead on teaching Zion to rise above them. After checking in, they proceeded to the security checkpoint where they would part ways. Isaiah handed the security officer Zion's documentation, explaining he was an unaccompanied minor. The officer barely glanced at the papers before waving them through to the special family lane. "I love you, Dad," Zion said, hugging his father one last time. "Love you more, little man," Isaiah replied, his throat tight. "Remember, you come from a long line of strong people. Nothing can break a Johnson." After one final wave, Zion disappeared through security, walking tall despite his small stature. Isaiah watched until he couldn't see his son anymore, then reluctantly turned away, already counting the minutes until Zion's return. Aboard Coastal Airways Flight 437, Amber Wilson moved efficiently through pre-flight checks. After 15 years as a flight attendant, these procedures were second nature. At 43, she took pride in running a tight cabin. Her colleagues described her as by the book, though some privately used less flattering terms. The truth was, Amber had become jaded. The once exciting career had devolved into managing increasingly entitled passengers and their endless demands. When she saw the unaccompanied minor paperwork for an 8-year-old named Zion Johnson, she silently sighed. Children traveling alone usually meant extra work. When the child boarded, a small black boy with neatly braided hair and solemn eyes, she plastered on her professional smile. "You must be Zion," she said, her voice carrying the sing-song tone adults often use with children. "We have a special seat for you right up front, where I can keep an eye on you." Zion nodded politely. "Thank you, ma'am." She raised an eyebrow at his formality but guided him to his seat in the second row. "The flight is nearly full today, so you'll have someone sitting next to you. Just press this button if you need anything." As other passengers boarded, Amber found herself watching Zion. Unlike most children his age, he sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, observing everything with those serious eyes. He followed all instructions to the letter, stowing his backpack, fastening his seatbelt without being asked, carefully reviewing the safety card. Bradley Thompson, a middle-aged white executive in an expensive suit, took the seat beside Zion. He nodded politely to the boy before opening his laptop. "Excuse me, sir," Zion said softly, "but the captain said all electronics should be turned off until we reach cruising altitude." Bradley looked surprised, then smiled. "You're absolutely right, young man. Thank you for the reminder." He closed his laptop, giving Zion an appraising look. "First time flying." "First time flying alone," Sir Zion replied. "My dad says it's important to follow all safety procedures." "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Bradley replied. In the rear galley, Leah Parker, a newer flight attendant in her late 20s, was preparing the beverage cart with Captain Raymond Fletcher. At 58, Fletcher was a company veteran with over 30 years of flying experience. "Looks like a full flight," Fletcher commented, checking the manifest. "Any troublemakers I should know about?" "All smooth so far," Leah replied, uncomfortable with how often Fletcher asked this question, particularly about certain demographics of passengers. "Good," he nodded. "I want an easy flight today." As the plane taxied and eventually took off, Zion watched the ground fall away with wide-eyed fascination. Bradley noticed the boy's white-knuckled grip on the armrest during takeoff, but made no comment, respecting the child's dignity. Once they reached cruising altitude, Zion relaxed slightly, his eyes never stopping their curious exploration of the cabin. Neither he nor any of the other passengers could have anticipated how quickly this routine flight was about to transform into a situation that would make national headlines and force an entire industry to confront its darkest biases. 2 hours into the 4-hour flight, Zion Johnson had proven himself to be the model passenger. He'd read quietly from his chapter book, colored in his activity book, and even helped the elderly woman across the aisle retrieve her dropped reading glasses without being asked. Bradley Thompson, the businessman seated beside him, had struck up occasional conversation, impressed by the boy's vocabulary and thoughtfulness. "My dad teaches at the community college sometimes," Zion explained, when Bradley commented on his articulate speech. "He says communication is a skill that can open doors no matter where you come from." Bradley nodded approvingly. "Your father sounds like a wise man." The first hint of trouble came when the plane encountered moderate turbulence. The aircraft shuddered, dropping suddenly before stabilizing. Several passengers gasped. Zion gripped his armrests, his normally composed face betraying momentary fear. "First time experiencing turbulence?" Bradley asked kindly. "No, sir," Zion replied, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "My dad explained, it's just like driving over bumps in the road. Nothing to worry about." Nevertheless, the turbulence continued intermittently, and Zion's breathing grew slightly labored. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small water bottle, only to discover it was empty. When Amber Wilson passed by with the beverage cart, Zion raised his hand politely, just as his father had taught him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice respectful. "May I have some water, please?" Amber glanced at him, but continued serving the passengers in the row ahead. "I'll get to your row in a minute," she replied curtly. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The beverage service continued, but Amber repeatedly skipped Zion's row while serving others who had boarded after him. Bradley Thompson noticed the pattern and frowned slightly but said nothing yet. When Amber finally reached their row, she served Bradley first, offering him a complete selection of beverages. When she turned to Zion, her demeanor changed subtly. "Water," she said flatly, not phrasing it as a question as she had with other passengers. "Yes, please," Zion replied. "Thank you, ma'am." She thrust a small plastic cup at him, filling it halfway before quickly moving on. Bradley raised an eyebrow. "Would you like some of my ginger ale?" he offered Zion. "It helps with an upset stomach during turbulence." "No thank you, sir," Zion replied. "My dad says I should never accept food or drinks from people I don't know, even if they seem nice." Bradley smiled. "Your dad gives good advice." The contrast in Amber's behavior became increasingly apparent as the flight progressed. When a white child about Zion's age asked for an extra snack, Amber responded with a warm smile and even brought him an extra package of cookies. When Zion politely requested a napkin after his water spilled slightly due to turbulence, Amber's response was immediate and harsh. "You need to be more careful." She snapped her voice loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. "That's how electronics get damaged and seats get ruined." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Zion replied, his voice small but dignified. "It was an accident." "Well, accidents can be expensive," Amber retorted, roughly thrusting a single napkin at him instead of the stack she'd provided to other passengers with similar minor spills. The spill was minimal, barely a tablespoon of water on Zion's own tray table, but Amber continued to make a scene, returning moments later with a disinfectant wipe and ostentatiously cleaning the area while sighing dramatically. "This is why children shouldn't travel alone," she muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Bradley Thompson had seen enough. As a senior executive at a major corporation who had recently undergone extensive diversity training, he recognized the differential treatment. "Excuse me," he said calmly to Amber. "I believe the spill has been adequately addressed." There was hardly any water, and the young man apologized appropriately. Amber stiffened. "Sir, I'm just doing my job, ensuring the aircraft remains clean and safe." "Of course," Bradley replied, his voice pleasant but firm. "I've just noticed that similar situations with other passengers were handled somewhat differently." Amber's eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, sir, but I treat all passengers equally." She walked away briskly, but her treatment of Zion noticeably worsened afterward. When the boy reached into his backpack to retrieve his asthma inhaler, a precaution his father had insisted he keep handy, Amber immediately returned. "What are you getting from your bag?" she demanded. "My inhaler, ma'am," Zion explained, showing her the prescription medication with his name clearly labeled. "I sometimes need it when I get nervous." "You never mentioned any medical condition during boarding," Amber said accusingly. "It was on my unaccompanied minor paperwork," Zion replied. "My dad made sure they included it." "Well, I didn't see it," Amber said, her tone suggesting Zion was being difficult. "You need to inform the flight crew of all medications." "I'm sorry, ma'am. I thought you knew." In the rear of the plane, Leah Parker had been observing these interactions with growing concern. She had noticed Amber's pattern of behavior toward Zion compared to her interactions with other passengers, particularly children. When she saw Amber confronting Zion about his inhaler, she decided to check the boy's paperwork herself. Sure enough, his asthma was clearly noted in his medical information, along with instructions for his prescription inhaler. As the confrontation over the inhaler escalated, Zion's breathing grew more labored, a clear anxiety response triggering his asthma symptoms. The situation was rapidly approaching a dangerous tipping point that would change everyone's lives forever. The tension in the cabin shifted from uncomfortable to alarming as Zion's breathing grew increasingly labored. His small chest heaved with effort, each inhale accompanied by a faint wheeze that Bradley Thompson recognized immediately from his own nephew's asthma attacks. "He needs his inhaler," Bradley stated, firmly abandoning his previous diplomatic tone. "This isn't a behavioral issue. He's having an asthma attack." Amber Wilson stood with her arms crossed, her posture rigid, as she blocked the aisle. "I need to verify this medication is authorized. There are procedures." "The procedure is to help a child who can't breathe," Bradley interrupted, his voice rising. "His medication is clearly labeled with his name and a prescription." Around them, passengers had begun to notice the confrontation. Several had their phones out recording the escalating situation. Zion sat rigid in his seat, one hand clutching his chest, the other still holding his inhaler, his eyes wide with growing panic as his airways constricted. "Ma'am," Zion gasped between labored breaths, "please. My dad says, always use it when this happens." Instead of relenting, Amber reached down and grasped Zion's arm, firmly attempting to take the inhaler from him. "Let me see that. We need to verify." "You're hurting me, Zion," wheezed his voice, barely audible, as Amber's grip tightened on his small arm. Bradley stood up abruptly. "Take your hands off him right now." His authoritative voice carried through the cabin, causing several passengers to turn in alarm. "Sir, I need you to sit down and not interfere with crew instructions," Amber responded, her voice taking on an official tone that contrasted sharply with her actions. Her grip on Zion's arm hadn't loosened, and the boy's breathing was becoming dangerously strained. From 3 rows back, a woman stood up. "I'm a pediatric nurse, and that child is having an asthma attack. He needs his medication immediately." "I am handling this situation," Amber insisted, but her voice wavered slightly as she became aware of the growing number of passengers watching and recording. The confrontation reached a critical point when Amber made a fateful decision. As Zion attempted to raise his inhaler to his mouth, she used her free hand to push his arm down effectively, preventing him from using his life-saving medication. In the process, her hand briefly pressed against his upper chest and lower neck as she leaned over him. "You need to calm down and listen," she said through clenched teeth, unaware that her actions were being captured from multiple angles by passengers' phones. For Zion, the world began to narrow as his oxygen-deprived brain struggled to process what was happening. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Stay calm, stay dignified, but never let anyone prevent you from getting help when you need it." With the last of his energy, he pressed the call button repeatedly, the universal signal of distress on an aircraft. Bradley Thompson had seen enough. He stood to his full height, his 6-foot frame imposing as he used his body to create space between Amber and Zion. "This has gone too far. He is having a medical emergency, and you are preventing him from receiving treatment. That is assault, and I am witnessing it, along with dozens of other passengers." From further back in the cabin, Leah Parker pushed her way forward, alerted by the commotion and the repeated call button. What she saw horrified her. Zion's lips were taking on a bluish tinge, a dangerous sign of oxygen deprivation. "Amber, stop!" Leah exclaimed, pushing past her colleague. "His asthma is documented in his paperwork. Let him use his inhaler." "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft," Amber hissed, but her grip on Zion finally loosened as she became aware of the public relations disaster unfolding. Leah quickly knelt beside Zion, helping him raise the inhaler to his lips. The boy took 2 desperate puffs, his eyes never leaving Amber's face as he fought for breath. Captain Raymond Fletcher's voice crackled over the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. We have a situation that requires flight attendant attention. All passengers must remain seated with seatbelts fastened." What the passengers couldn't see was that Fletcher had activated the cockpit camera to observe the cabin and had witnessed only part of the confrontation, the part where Bradley Thompson stood up and intervened. He hadn't seen the beginning of the incident, or Amber preventing Zion from using his inhaler. Amber seized on the captain's announcement. "Sir, the captain has ordered all passengers to remain seated. You need to sit down immediately." Bradley remained standing. "I will sit when this child receives proper medical attention and is no longer in danger." "He's being disruptive," Amber said loudly, clearly playing to the cockpit camera. "He refused to follow instructions and became combative when I attempted to verify his medication." The blatant mischaracterization of events caused an immediate reaction throughout the cabin. A chorus of objections rose from witnesses, with several passengers shouting that Amber was lying. "We all saw what happened. she wouldn't let him use his inhaler. The boy couldn't breathe. She put her hands on his neck. Captain Fletcher's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a harder edge. "This is the captain. We are diverting to Denver International Airport due to a disruptive passenger situation. Flight attendants prepare the cabin for landing." Zion, finally able to breathe somewhat normally thanks to his inhaler, looked up at Leah with tears in his eyes. "Am I in trouble? I didn't do anything wrong. I just couldn't breathe." "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble," Leah assured him, shooting a disgusted look at Amber, who had retreated to the galley to confer with another flight attendant. With shaking hands, Zion reached for the seatback phone. "I need to call my dad," he whispered. "He told me to call if anything bad happened." As Leah helped him dial, no one on the plane could have predicted the chain of events that would unfold once Isaiah Johnson learned what had happened to his son, or how quickly he would arrive. Would you continue watching a child struggle to breathe, or would you step in like Bradley did? Comment number 1 if you believe Amber should lose her job immediately, or number 2 if you think she deserves a chance to explain her actions. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're outraged by this treatment, and subscribe for more stories of justice being served. What do you think Isaiah will do when he discovers what happened to his son? Keep watching to find out how a Navy SEAL father responds to his child being mistreated. The sudden announcement of an emergency landing sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. Outside the windows, the plane banked sharply as Captain Fletcher redirected their course toward Denver International Airport. Ironically, Zion's intended destination, though they were arriving under circumstances no one could have anticipated. In the cockpit, Fletcher was on the radio with Denver Air Traffic Control, his voice betraying none of the bias that had influenced his decision. Coastal Airways Flight 437 requesting priority landing due to disruptive passenger situation. No physical threats to aircraft, but we need security to meet the plane. Copy that, Coastal 437, came the response. You are cleared for priority approach to runway 26. Security will be standing by. Do you require medical assistance as well? Fletcher hesitated, then replied, affirmative. We have a minor who may require medical evaluation. He didn't specify the nature of the medical issue, leaving Denver authorities with incomplete information. In the main cabin, Zion had finally managed to reach his father on the seatback phone, his voice trembling as he recounted what had happened. Leah Parker stood protectively beside him, ensuring Amber couldn't interfere with the call. Dad Zion whispered, his voice still raspy from the asthma attack. Something bad happened. The flight attendant wouldn't let me use my inhaler, and she grabbed me. 2,000 miles away in Nashville, Isaiah Johnson felt a cold fury crystallize in his chest as he listened to his son's labored breathing. Years of SEAL training had taught him to channel emotion into focused action, and that discipline kicked in automatically. Are you breathing okay now, son? He asked, his voice deliberately calm. Yes, sir. The nice lady flight attendant helped me, and Mr. Thompson protected me. I'm proud of you for calling me, Isaiah said. Can you put one of the adults on the phone? Leah took the receiver, introducing herself quickly and confirming Zion's account. We're being diverted to Denver right now. The captain is claiming it's because of a disruptive passenger, but that's not what happened. Your son did absolutely nothing wrong. I understand, Isaiah replied, his voice measured. Please tell my son I'll be there when the plane lands. Sir, we're landing in Denver in approximately 40 minutes. I don't see how. I'll be there, Isaiah repeated, with quiet certainty. Please stay with my son. As Isaiah hung up, he was already making calls. First to his former commanding officer, now stationed at the Pentagon, then to a SEAL teammate who worked as a federal air marshal, and finally to his attorney. As a highly decorated veteran with multiple combat deployments and distinguished service medals, Isaiah had connections that could cut through bureaucratic red tape in emergencies. Back on the plane, Amber Wilson was in full damage control mode. She moved through the cabin with a clipboard speaking quietly to select passengers, primarily those who hadn't witnessed the full confrontation, attempting to gather statements supporting her version of events. The boy became agitated and refused to follow safety instructions, she murmured to an elderly man who'd been asleep during most of the incident. "I need to document witness accounts for official purposes." Bradley Thompson observed this with growing indignation. He stood and addressed the cabin loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If anyone is being asked to sign statements about what occurred, I strongly advise you to be certain it accurately reflects what you personally witnessed. There are numerous video recordings of the actual events that will contradict any false narratives." Amber shot him a venomous look, but retreated to the galley where she conferred intensely with Captain Fletcher over the intercom. Together, they crafted a narrative the businessman had interfered with flight crew duties during a routine medication check, and the child had become combative when asked to follow standard procedures. Meanwhile, Zion sat quietly in his seat, following his father's instructions to remain calm and say nothing further to Amber. The inhaler had helped stabilize his breathing, but the emotional trauma of the experience was evident in his too still posture and vigilant eyes. Passengers from nearby rows had moved to sit closer to him, forming a protective circle around the child. A young woman in the row behind him leaned forward. "Hey buddy, I got the whole thing on video. Your dad will be able to see exactly what happened." Zion nodded gratefully, his eyes still wary as he tracked Amber's movements through the cabin. As the aircraft began its descent into Denver, Leah Parker knelt beside Zion's seat. "Your dad said he'll be there when we land," she told him. "I'm not sure how that's possible with the flight change, but I'll stay with you until we figure things out." "My dad always keeps his promises," Zion replied simply. The plane touched down at Denver International with a firm jolt, taxiing rapidly to a remote gate where 3 police vehicles, an ambulance, and airport security waited on the tarmac. What no one on the plane realized was that a 4th unmarked black SUV had also arrived, having been expedited through airport security by federal authorities. As soon as the aircraft doors opened, 2 paramedics boarded first, directed immediately to Zion by Leah. They quickly assessed him, confirming he had indeed suffered an asthma attack, and documenting the finger-shaped bruises beginning to form on his arm where Amber had gripped him. Captain Fletcher emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp and authoritative, as he approached the police officers who had boarded. "We had a situation with a disruptive adult passenger interfering with crew member duties." He began gesturing toward Bradley Thompson, and an unaccompanied minor who... He never finished the sentence. A commanding voice from the jetway cut through the cabin like a blade. "My son has asthma," which was clearly documented in his travel paperwork. "I'd like to understand why he was physically restrained from using his prescribed medication during an attack." Every head turned toward the imposing figure who had boarded the aircraft. Standing in the doorway was Isaiah Johnson, dressed in civilian clothes but radiating unmistakable military bearing. His calm was more terrifying than any display of anger could have been. Captain Fletcher's face registered shock. "How did you... This area is restricted to..." "I believe my federal credentials were found to be in order," Isaiah replied, evenly moving directly to his son. He knelt beside Zion, quickly assessing him with practiced eyes, before embracing him tightly. "You did exactly right, son," he whispered fiercely. "I'm here now." No one on that aircraft, least of all Amber Wilson and Raymond Fletcher, could have anticipated how quickly their world was about to unravel, or how a routine flight would become the catalyst for long overdue change in an entire industry. Isaiah Johnson's presence transformed the atmosphere on the aircraft instantly. Though dressed in civilian clothes, a charcoal gray button-down and dark jeans, everything about him communicated military precision and controlled power. The whispers spread rapidly through the cabin. "That's his dad. How did he get here so fast? I heard he's special forces. While cradling Zion with one arm, Isaiah addressed the paramedics with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis situations. My son has exercise-induced asthma, exacerbated by anxiety. He uses an albuterol inhaler, 90 mg. Last dose approximately 35 minutes ago during the acute attack. He has no other medical conditions or allergies. The lead paramedic nodded, impressed by the precise information. We'd still like to check his oxygen levels and listen to his lungs, if that's all right with you, sir. Proceed, Isaiah agreed, keeping a reassuring hand on Zion's shoulder as the paramedics attached a pulse oximeter to the boy's finger and placed a stethoscope on his chest. Oxygen saturation at 94%, the paramedic reported. Lower than optimal, but not critical. Lungs still have some wheezing, but are clearing. He should be monitored, but it doesn't appear he needs hospitalization. Throughout this exchange, Captain Fletcher and Amber Wilson stood frozen, their carefully constructed narrative crumbling before their eyes. The police officers who had boarded initially expecting to remove a disruptive passenger now looked uncertainly between the flight crew and the clearly composed military father caring for his distressed child. Bradley Thompson seized the moment to approach one of the officers. "Sir, I believe you should know that numerous passengers recorded the incident." The child was physically prevented from using his prescribed inhaler during an asthma attack, despite having proper documentation. The officer raised an eyebrow. That's a serious allegation. One easily verified by the videos at least a dozen passengers recorded, Bradley replied, gesturing around the cabin where multiple phones were still pointed at the unfolding scene. Amber finally found her voice, stepping forward with practiced authority. "This passenger," she pointed at, "Bradley interfered with my duties during a routine safety check." The minor became agitated, and, "My son has a name." "Isaiah," interrupted, his voice quiet, but carrying throughout the suddenly silent cabin. "His name is Zion Johnson. He's 8 years old, has asthma documented in his travel paperwork, and according to multiple witnesses was physically restrained from using his prescribed medication." He turned to face Amber directly. "I'd like to understand why you put your hands on my son's body and prevented him from taking medication that he legally possesses and is medically required to use." Amber's composure faltered under Isaiah's steady gaze. "I was following company protocol for verifying medications." He became uncooperative and, "Liar." The accusation came from an elderly woman 4 rows back. "We all saw what happened. You ignored that child for hours, then manhandled him when he needed his medicine. I have it all on video." Another passenger called out. Captain Fletcher attempted to regain control of the situation. "As the captain of this aircraft, I need to inform everyone that recording crew members without consent is against company policy, and recording instances of discrimination and medical neglect is protected by federal law," came a new voice from the jetway. A man in a crisp suit stepped onto the plane, presenting credentials to the police officers. "Martin Reynolds, Federal Aviation Administration. We received multiple reports of a serious incident aboard this flight. I'll need statements from all crew members and any passengers willing to provide them." Fletcher's face drained of color as he recognized the FAA investigators' authority. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple customer service issue. Isaiah turned his attention back to his son, speaking gently. "Zion, I need you to tell these officers exactly what happened, just like we've practiced. Clear, honest, and detailed." Zion nodded his composure, returning now that his father was present. With remarkable articulation for an 8-year-old, he recounted the events, how Amber had repeatedly ignored him while serving others, her disproportionate reaction to the water spill, and finally her physical intervention when he tried to use his inhaler. "She squeezed my arm really tight," he concluded, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the darkening bruises in the shape of fingerprints. "And then she pushed down here," he pointed to his upper chest and lower neck, so I couldn't raise my inhaler to my mouth. That's when I really couldn't breathe, and Mr. Thompson stood up to help me. The police officers exchanged glances, their initial assumption about the situation completely reversed. One of them turned to Amber. "Ma'am, these are very serious allegations, supported by multiple witnesses and apparent physical evidence." Amber's professional demeanor cracked completely. "You don't understand the pressure we're under. These unaccompanied minors are constantly breaking rules, and we're responsible if anything happens." He was reaching into his bag without permission, and I was just following. Protocol. The protocol for a child having an asthma attack is to help them use their medication, Leah Parker stated firmly, stepping forward from where she had been quietly observing. "I've worked for Coastal Airways for 3 years, and there is absolutely no protocol that justifies physically restraining a child from using a prescribed inhaler." She turned to the FAA investigator. "Mr. Reynolds, I've witnessed a pattern of differential treatment from both Flight Attendant Wilson and Captain Fletcher toward passengers of color. Today's incident was extreme, but not isolated." Captain Fletcher's face reddened. "Parker, you're out of line. Your probationary status. Threatening a whistleblower is also against federal regulations." Reynolds interrupted smoothly. "Ms. Parker will take your statement separately." Isaiah Johnson, who had been quietly assessing the situation while comforting his son, finally addressed the gathered officials. "I want to be clear about my intentions here. My primary concern is my son's well-being. However, this incident represents something far more significant than one bad flight experience." He stood to his full height, his military bearing unmistakable. "I've served this country through 3 combat deployments as a Navy SEAL. I've bled for the ideals America claims to uphold. Today, my 8-year-old son was physically assaulted because of assumptions made about him based on the color of his skin. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not a case of following protocol. This is discrimination that endangered my child's life, and it will be addressed appropriately." The cabin fell completely silent. Even the most distracted passengers could feel the weight of his words and the quiet authority with which he delivered them. "I have connections throughout the military, government, and airline industry," Isaiah continued. "I could make calls that would end careers instantly. But that's not how justice works. What I want is accountability, systemic change, and assurance that no other child will experience what my son did today." Bradley Thompson stood up. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Bradley Thompson, Senior Vice President at Meridian Consulting. We specialize in corporate diversity training and compliance. I witnessed everything that happened to your son, and I'd like to offer my firm's services pro bono to assist in whatever way would be most helpful." Isaiah nodded his appreciation as the FAA investigator moved to the center of the aisle. "All passengers will be deplaned shortly. We're requesting that anyone with video evidence, please share it with our investigators. Those willing to provide statements can do so in the terminal." As passengers began collecting their belongings, Isaiah knelt beside Zion again. "You handled yourself with dignity and courage today," he said softly. "I couldn't be prouder." Zion looked up at his father, his eyes wise beyond his years. "Dad, are they in big trouble?" Isaiah glanced at Amber and Captain Fletcher, now being interviewed separately by investigators. "Yes, son. But more importantly, this might help make things better for lots of other people." As they prepared to deplane, neither of them could have predicted how right Isaiah's words would prove to be, or how far-reaching the consequences of this day would become. The scene that greeted Isaiah and Zion Johnson as they exited the jetway was unprecedented. The concourse had been partially cleared, creating a secure area where airport police, FAA officials, and Coastal Airways executives had gathered. But beyond the security cordon, a crowd had formed. Passengers from connecting flights with phones, raised airport employees watching with concerned expressions, and most surprisingly, several news crews setting up equipment. "How did the media get here so quickly?" Isaiah murmured to Bradley Thompson. who had stayed close by as they deplaned. Social media, Bradley replied grimly, showing Isaiah his phone. Passengers were live streaming even before we landed. It's already trending number Coastal Airways assault and number Let Zion breathe. Isaiah instinctively positioned himself to shield Zion from the cameras. I didn't want this kind of exposure for him. Dad, it's okay, Zion said quietly. You always say that sometimes doing the right thing means being uncomfortable. A slight smile touched Isaiah's lips at hearing his own words reflected back to him. That's true, son. I just didn't expect you'd have to apply that lesson so young. A distinguished-looking man in an impeccable suit broke away from the group of executives and approached them. Mr. Johnson, I'm Victor Pearson, Chief Operating Officer for Coastal Airways. First, let me express my profound regret for what happened to your son today. Isaiah assessed the executive with a practiced eye, noting the genuine concern in his expression, but also the calculated damage control underway. I appreciate you coming personally, Mr. Pearson, but I'd prefer any discussions about this incident take place with my attorney present. Of course, Pearson nodded. We've arranged a private lounge for your comfort while Zion will need to be examined more thoroughly by his regular physician. Isaiah interrupted. My priority is getting him proper medical attention. Before Pearson could respond, a commotion at the terminal entrance drew everyone's attention. 4 men in civilian clothes but with unmistakable military bearing entered the concourse, moving with coordinated precision toward Isaiah. Command Master Chief, the lead man, called out using Isaiah's former SEAL team designation as he approached and clasped Isaiah's hand firmly. We came as soon as we got your message. Isaiah's expression softened slightly at the sight of his former teammates. Mason wasn't expecting the whole squad. When one of our kids is mistreated, we all show up, replied Mason Rivera, his face grave. Ramirez is handling perimeter security. Williams is coordinating with airport administration, and Carter is dealing with the media requests. The arrival of 4 former Navy SEALs instantly changed the dynamic in the terminal. Airport security officers straightened their posture, the Coastal Airways executives huddled in concerned conversation, and the FAA investigators watched with newfound interest. Meanwhile, passengers from Flight 437 had begun sharing their videos with investigators and media outlets. The footage was damning, clearly showing Amber Wilson ignoring Zion's requests for water, her disproportionate reaction to the minor spill, and most disturbingly, her physically preventing him from using his inhaler during an asthma attack. One particularly clear video captured her hand pressing against Zion's chest and lower neck as she leaned over him while his lips visibly turned blue from oxygen deprivation. Within an hour, the first clips appeared on national news networks, accompanied by headlines like "Child Prevented from Using Inhaler on Coastal Airways Flight" and "Racial Discrimination at 30000 feet Navy SEAL Father Responds." Social media amplified the story exponentially. Hashtags multiplied and video clips went viral across platforms. Former passengers began sharing their own experiences with Coastal Airways, revealing a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had gone unaddressed for years. By evening, the story had reached the corporate headquarters of Coastal Airways, where an emergency board meeting was called. The company's stock had dropped 7% in after-hours trading, and major shareholders were demanding immediate action. Back at the Denver airport, Isaiah sat with Zion in a private medical facility while a physician conducted a thorough examination. Bradley Thompson waited outside, working his phone continuously as he coordinated with his law firm colleagues. Mr. Johnson, Bradley said, when Isaiah emerged from the examination room, I've been in touch with Vanessa Reynolds from our legal team. She specializes in civil rights violations and would like to represent you and Zion pro bono. Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. I appreciate that, but my focus right now is Zion's well-being. I understand completely, Bradley replied. But there's something else you should know. Our firm has been collecting data on discriminatory incidents in the airline industry for years, preparing for a case exactly like this one. Zion's experience wasn't isolated. It's part of a documented pattern at Coastal Airways and several other carriers. Isaiah's expression hardened. How extensive? Over 300 incidents in the past 5 years, disproportionately affecting Black passengers, particularly children. Most were settled quietly, with non-disclosure agreements. That's why nothing ever changes. Before Isaiah could respond, Mason Rivera approached with a tablet. "Chief, you need to see this. Leah Parker, the flight attendant who helped Zion, just gave an interview to CNN." On screen, Leah stood composed but visibly emotional as she spoke to a reporter. "I've witnessed discriminatory behavior toward passengers of color since my first day at Coastal Airways. We received implicit messages during training about which passengers to watch more closely and which ones received the benefit of the doubt. Today wasn't an anomaly. It was just the first time someone with the resources and connections to fight back was directly affected." The reporter pressed further. "Are you concerned about repercussions for speaking out?" "Of course," Leah replied steadily. "But I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent. This industry has systematic problems that need to be addressed, and Captain Fletcher and Flight Attendant Wilson are just symptoms of a much larger issue." As the interview concluded, Mason muted the tablet. "She's brave," he commented. "Probably just ended her career." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Isaiah replied, his decision crystallizing. "Bradley, please have Miss Reynolds contact me. I think we need to talk after all." As evening fell, the story continued to evolve. Coastal Airways issued a preliminary statement announcing that Amber Wilson and Raymond Fletcher had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The statement was carefully worded, emphasizing the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion while avoiding any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The public response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. The corporate statement was perceived as inadequate damage control rather than genuine accountability. Meanwhile, Zion's story had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the incident itself, becoming a symbol of the everyday indignities and dangers faced by people of color in America. In a hotel suite secured by his former teammates, Isaiah made a series of calls to his attorney, to Zion's grandparents, and finally, to a journalist he trusted from his military days. He was done being reactive. It was time to take control of the narrative. "Zion," he said, gently sitting beside his son, who was watching the unfolding media coverage with wide eyes. "Things are going to get very public very quickly. People will recognize you want to talk to you, maybe even try to use you to make a point. I need to know how you feel about that." Zion considered the question with the seriousness Isaiah had always encouraged. "Will it help other kids like me?" "I believe it will," Isaiah replied honestly. "But it won't be easy." Zion nodded, his expression solemn. "Dad, when you got hurt in the war and got that medal, you said, sometimes one person has to stand up so others don't have to. Is this like that?" Isaiah's throat tightened with emotion. "Yes, son, very much like that." "Then I want to do it," Zion said firmly. "But can you stay with me the whole time?" Every single second, Isaiah promised, pulling his son into a tight embrace. Neither of them could have predicted how their stand would catalyze change throughout an entire industry, or how many lives would be impacted by their decision to fight rather than settle quietly. The story that had begun with a child's struggle to breathe was about to become a national conversation about race, power, and accountability in America. 3 weeks after the incident aboard Flight 437, the headquarters of Coastal Airways buzzed with tense activity. In a glass-walled conference room on the executive floor, CEO Walter Harrington faced the most significant crisis of his 20-year tenure. The Department of Transportation has officially launched a civil rights investigation, announced Caroline Maxwell, the airline's chief legal counsel, her expression grim. They're demanding complete records of all passenger complaints involving race or ethnicity from the past 5 years, plus our internal handling procedures. Harrington winced. How bad is it going to look? Extremely bad, Maxwell replied bluntly. Our settlement history shows a clear pattern. We've confidentially resolved 17 cases involving African American passengers in the past 3 years alone. The Johnson case has essentially invalidated our NDA strategy by making the pattern public. On the large screen dominating the wall, financial projections painted an equally dire picture. Coastal Airways stock had plummeted 22% since the video of Zion Johnson's treatment went viral. Major corporate clients had suspended their business travel contracts pending the outcome of the investigation. A consumer boycott was gaining momentum daily. We need to settle with the Johnsons, immediately suggested Richard Gaines, the chief financial officer. Whatever it takes. They've declined all settlement offers, Maxwell responded. Isaiah Johnson isn't interested in money. He's demanding structural changes and public accountability. Then give him that too, Harrington exclaimed, frustration evident in his voice. Draft a comprehensive reform plan, whatever he wants. We need this to go away. It's too late for that approach, came a new voice from the doorway. Vanessa Reynolds entered the room, her professional demeanor belying the bombshell she was about to deliver. As the lead attorney representing the Johnson family, her presence in Coastal Airways headquarters sent an immediate chill through the executive team. Miss Reynolds Harrington began regaining his composure. This is a private meeting. And this is a class action notification, she replied, placing a document on the conference table. Isaiah Johnson is declining individual settlement to serve as lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit representing 342 passengers who have experienced racial discrimination on Coastal Airways flights. You'll find the filing details here. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A class action suit would mean years of litigation, millions in potential damages, and most significantly, full public disclosure of the airline's internal practices. This isn't just about Amber Wilson or Raymond Fletcher anymore. Reynolds continued, her voice steady. This is about systemic issues throughout your corporate culture. Mr. Johnson is prepared to see this through to the end. Across town, in a modest hotel suite that had become their temporary headquarters, Isaiah Johnson sat with Bradley Thompson and a team from Meridian Consulting reviewing the preliminary findings of their investigation into Coastal Airways. The pattern is undeniable, Bradley explained, displaying a series of charts on his laptop. Complaints from passengers of color are routinely downgraded in priority, settled quietly, or simply buried. Meanwhile, the employees involved rarely face meaningful consequences. Isaiah nodded grimly. And Amber Wilson. 7 previous complaints over her 15-year career, all from Black or Hispanic passengers. None resulted in disciplinary action beyond additional training. What about Captain Fletcher? Bradley hesitated. That's where it gets interesting. We found his social media accounts. They're locked down now, but we have screenshots. He turned his laptop to show a series of posts that revealed Fletcher's deeply problematic views on race. Isaiah's expression remained controlled, but his eyes hardened. This goes far beyond one flight attendant making a bad decision under pressure. Exactly, Bradley agreed. This is about an organizational culture that enabled and protected people like Wilson and Fletcher while dismissing the experiences of passengers like Zion. The door opened, and Zion entered with Mason Rivera, returning from a visit to the Denver Aquarium, a brief respite from the intense media attention. Despite the circumstances, Zion's resilience continued to amaze everyone around him. "Dad, we saw sharks and giant sea turtles," Zion exclaimed, his face lighting up with childlike wonder that provided a poignant reminder of just how young he was. Isaiah smiled, pulling his son into a quick hug. "Sounds awesome, buddy." Did you thank Mr. Rivera for taking you?" "Yes, sir," Zion nodded. "And I took notes for my school report like you said." Even amid the legal battle, Isaiah maintained his focus on Zion's education and normal childhood development. He had arranged for Zion's assignments to be sent from his school, insisting that advocacy work should never come at the expense of his son's learning. While Isaiah had declined most media appearances for Zion, he had carefully selected one interview with a respected journalist who agreed to his strict conditions. The resulting segment had humanized Zion beyond the viral videos, showing him as a thoughtful, articulate child who loved science, basketball, and Marvel superheroes. The interview had shifted public perception dramatically, moving from abstract outrage over discrimination to emotional connection with an actual child who had been harmed. Donations to the newly established Johnson Foundation for Transportation Equity had surged, providing resources for other families without Isaiah's connections or resources. Meanwhile, Leah Parker had become an unexpected hero in the unfolding story. After giving her CNN interview, she had been formally terminated by Coastal Airways, but the public backlash was immediate and fierce. Within days, the airline had reinstated her with an official apology. Now she was working directly with transportation officials to develop new training protocols for flight crews. The consequences extended far beyond Coastal Airways. Other major carriers, sensing the shifting landscape, had preemptively announced reviews of their own practices. Congress had scheduled hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation with Isaiah Johnson among those invited to testify. Not everyone supported their cause. Isaiah had received threats serious enough to warrant security precautions arranged by his former SEAL teammates. Conservative commentators had attempted to portray Zion as disruptive and Isaiah as opportunistic, though these narratives largely collapsed when the complete unedited videos were released. Most painfully, Amber Wilson had given a tearful interview claiming she was being scapegoated for systemic issues and that her actions had been misinterpreted. Her interview had prompted a wave of sympathy from some quarters, complicating the public narrative. That evening, as Isaiah tucked Zion into bed in their hotel suite, his son asked a question that cut to the heart of their situation. "Dad, is Miss Wilson a bad person?" Isaiah considered carefully before answering. "I don't believe most people are all good or all bad, Zion. Miss Wilson made very bad choices that day, and those choices hurt you. Whether those choices came from fear, bias, or something else, they were still wrong. But now she's crying on TV saying she's sorry. Sometimes people are sorry they got caught, not sorry for what they did," Isaiah explained gently. "Real accountability means acknowledging exactly what you did wrong and working to make it right, not just saying you're sorry when there are consequences." Zion nodded thoughtfully. "Like when I broke Mom's favorite vase and tried to hide it instead of telling the truth right away." Isaiah's heart twisted at the mention of Maria. "Exactly like that. Remember how much harder it was because you waited." "Yeah. And you said integrity means doing the right thing, even when it's hard." "That's right," Isaiah affirmed, smoothing his son's curly hair. "And you're showing incredible integrity through all of this. I'm so proud of you." As Zion drifted off to sleep, Isaiah's phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa Reynolds' Coastal Airways board meeting tomorrow. Sources say CEO Harrington may be forced to resign. This is just the beginning. Isaiah set the phone aside, gazing at his sleeping son. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time since Maria's death, he felt certain they were exactly where they needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. Sometimes standing up against injustice was the only choice that allowed you to live with yourself, a lesson he hoped Zion would carry throughout his life. 6 months after the incident on Flight 437, Isaiah Johnson stood at a podium in a packed congressional hearing room, the seal of the United States gleaming on the wall behind him. Camera flashes punctuated the hushed atmosphere as he prepared to testify before the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Mr. Johnson began. Congresswoman Eleanor Martinez, the committee chairperson, we appreciate your willingness to appear today. Before we discuss the proposed Airline Passengers Civil Rights Act, would you share your perspective on how a single incident involving your son has catalyzed such widespread change? Isaiah adjusted the microphone, his composed demeanor belying the significance of the moment. Chairwoman Martinez, distinguished committee members, what happened to my son was not a single incident. It was one visible example of a pattern affecting countless Americans every day. The only unusual aspect was that Zion had a father with the resources and connections to ensure it couldn't be ignored or silenced. In the 6 months since the viral video had shocked the nation, the landscape of commercial aviation had undergone remarkable transformation. Coastal Airways, once among the industry's most prominent carriers, had experienced a complete leadership overhaul. CEO Walter Harrington had resigned under pressure from the board. The new chief executive, Elaine Washington, the first African-American woman to lead a major airline, had implemented sweeping reforms. Amber Wilson and Raymond Fletcher had both been terminated after internal and FAA investigations confirmed multiple violations of company policy and federal regulations. More significantly, the airline had commissioned an independent audit of its customer service practices, which revealed systemic biases in how complaints were handled and how employees were trained. The proposed legislation before you today, Isaiah continued, would standardize non-discrimination protocols across all carriers, require transparent reporting of civil rights complaints, and establish an independent review board with actual enforcement authority. These changes would help ensure that passengers' rights don't depend on viral videos or media attention to be respected. In the audience, Zion watched his father with unmistakable pride. At 9 years old now, having celebrated a birthday amid the whirlwind of legal proceedings and advocacy work, he had developed a remarkable poise. Seated beside him was Bradley Thompson, whose consulting firm had expanded dramatically as airlines and transportation companies scrambled to address biases in their corporate cultures. On Zion's other side sat Leah Parker, whose courage in speaking out had transformed her from a probationary flight attendant to a respected advocate for workplace ethics. She had recently been appointed to lead Coastal Airways' newly established Office of Inclusive Customer Experience, turning her whistleblower status into a position of genuine influence. Mr. Johnson asked Congressman James Richardson, "Some critics have suggested that the penalties proposed in this legislation are excessive and could financially burden an already struggling industry. How would you respond?" "Congressman, I would suggest that the financial consequences of discrimination are already substantial," Isaiah replied evenly. Coastal Airways lost over $2 billion in market value following their mishandling of this incident. Their legal settlements will likely exceed $100 million. The proposed penalties in this legislation are modest by comparison and have the advantage of being preventative rather than reactive. What Isaiah didn't mention was his personal involvement in shaping those settlements. Rather than accepting monetary compensation for Zion, he had insisted that Coastal Airways fund a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all customer-facing employees. The Johnson Protocol, as it had become known, was now being adopted voluntarily by other carriers, eager to avoid similar incidents. The afternoon session featured testimony from Dr. Monica Williams, a renowned expert in racial bias and customer service environments. What we witnessed in the case of Zion Johnson represents a phenomenon called adultification bias, she explained to the committee. Black children are routinely perceived as older, less innocent, and more culpable than their white peers. In high-stress environments, like aircraft cabins, this bias can have dangerous consequences when it affects how authority figures respond to children's basic needs. The hearings continued for 3 days with testimony from airline executives, civil rights advocates, and other passengers who had experienced discrimination. Throughout the proceedings, Isaiah maintained the calm, dignified presence that had characterized his approach from the beginning. On the final day, in an unexpected development, the committee invited Zion himself to make a brief statement. Isaiah had initially refused, but ultimately decided to respect his son's wish to speak for himself. After careful preparation, and with his father's supportive presence beside him, Zion approached the microphone. "My name is Zion Johnson. I'm 9 years old," he began, his clear voice steady, despite the imposing setting. "What happened to me was scary, but my dad always says that scary things can lead to important change if we're brave enough to face them." The room fell completely silent as this child, whose suffering had been broadcast worldwide, shared his perspective with remarkable eloquence. "I don't want any kid to feel like they can't breathe and nobody will help them," Zion continued. "I don't want anybody to be treated differently because of what they look like. My mom died when I was little, but she always told me to stand up for what's right. That's what my dad and I are trying to do." There wasn't a dry eye in the hearing room as Zion concluded his brief but powerful testimony. Even normally stoic legislators were visibly moved, and the moment was captured in photographs that would appear on front pages nationwide the following day. That evening, as they returned to their hotel, Isaiah received an unexpected message from his attorney. Amber Wilson had requested a private meeting with the Johnsons outside the legal proceedings. After initial hesitation and extensive discussion with Zion, Isaiah agreed to a carefully structured conversation. 2 days later, in a neutral location with attorneys present, Amber Wilson faced Isaiah and Zion Johnson for the first time since the incident. Gone was the defensive posture from her television interview, replaced by a woman who appeared to have undergone profound reflection. "I've spent 6 months trying to justify my actions that day," she began, her voice unsteady, "telling myself I was following protocol, that I was under pressure, that anyone might have reacted the same way. But watching your congressional testimony forced me to finally admit the truth. I treated Zion differently than I would have treated a white child in the same situation." She turned directly to Zion, meeting his eyes for the first time. "What I did was wrong. I endangered your health. I humiliated you in front of others. And worst of all, I violated the fundamental trust that should exist between an adult in authority and a child needing help. No apology can undo that harm, but I want you to know that I recognize exactly what I did wrong and I am truly sorry." Zion listened with remarkable composure, then looked to his father. Isaiah nodded slightly, encouraging him to respond as they had discussed. "Thank you for saying that," Miss Wilson, Zion said quietly. "My dad says that real change starts when people tell the truth about what happened." The meeting concluded without dramatic reconciliation, but with something perhaps more valuable, a genuine acknowledgement of harm and responsibility that might serve as a foundation for healing. As they left the meeting, Isaiah received news that would mark the culmination of their 6-month journey. The Airline Passengers Civil Rights Act had passed out of committee with bipartisan support and was headed for a floor vote with favorable prospects. The legislation included key provisions they had advocated for, including mandatory anti-bias training for all air crews, transparent reporting requirements for civil rights complaints, and an independent oversight board with real enforcement authority. "Did we do it?" Dad Zion asked, as they walked hand in hand through the Capitol grounds, cherry blossoms swirling around them in the spring breeze. "Did we fix it?" Isaiah squeezed his son's hand. "We helped start something important, son. Fixing systemic problems takes time, and many people working together. But yes, I believe we've made a real difference." As they made their way back to the hotel, Isaiah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a moment of terror at 3,000 feet. The path had been difficult, but the transformation, both in the industry and in Zion himself, had been remarkable to witness. His son had emerged from trauma not as a victim but as an advocate, turning pain into purpose in a way that honored Maria's memory and reflected the values they had always tried to instill. The true measure of their impact would unfold in the months and years ahead, as new protocols were implemented and corporate cultures slowly shifted. But whatever the future held, Isaiah knew that Zion would face it with the same courage and dignity he had demonstrated throughout this chapter of their lives. 1 year to the day after the incident aboard Flight 437, Zion Johnson stood in the crowded terminal of Denver International Airport, a look of quiet determination on his face as he clutched his boarding pass. At 10 years old now, he had grown nearly 2 inches taller and carried himself with a confidence born of extraordinary experience. "You ready for this, little man?" Isaiah asked, placing a supportive hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes, sir," Zion nodded firmly. "I'm ready." This flight was symbolic in more ways than one. It marked Zion's first time boarding an aircraft since the traumatic incident a year earlier. It was also the inaugural journey of Coastal Airways' completely redesigned youth travel program, which Zion himself had helped develop as part of the airline's comprehensive reforms. The changes at Coastal Airways over the past year had been revolutionary. Under CEO Elaine Washington's leadership, the company had transformed from a case study in crisis mismanagement to an industry leader in inclusive customer service. The Johnson Protocol for Anti-Bias Training was now mandatory for all employees, with refresher courses every 6 months. The airline had established an independent passenger advocacy office with direct reporting lines to the board of directors. Most significantly, they had revised every aspect of their unaccompanied minor program with input from child development experts, civil rights organizations, and Zion himself. "Mr. Johnson, Zion, we're ready for you now." The voice belonged to Michael Chen, Coastal Airways' new Director of Customer Experience, personally overseeing this high-profile flight. The media presence was carefully controlled. No cameras inside the terminal by Isaiah's request, but the significance of the moment was not lost on anyone present. As they approached the gate, Isaiah noticed Zion's steps slow slightly. He knelt to eye level with his son. "Remember, you don't have to do this. We can turn around right now, no questions asked." Zion took a deep breath, his expression resolute. "Dad, you always say courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right, even when you are scared." Isaiah smiled, his chest tightening with pride. "That's my boy." Together, they proceeded to the gate, where a new team of specially trained flight attendants waited to welcome Zion aboard. The lead attendant, a warm-faced woman named Denise Reynolds, knelt to introduce herself directly to Zion rather than speaking through his father. "It's an honor to have you with us today, Zion," she said sincerely. "I want you to know that I personally reviewed your medical information, including your asthma management plan. Your inhaler is noted in our system, and every crew member is aware that you might need to use it at any time without restriction." Zion nodded, visibly relaxing at this explicit acknowledgement. "Thank you, ma'am." The boarding process proceeded smoothly, with Isaiah accompanying Zion to his seat. Another change in policy that allowed parents to settle unaccompanied minors before deplaning. As they walked through the first-class cabin toward Zion's premium seat, upgraded courtesy of the airline, Isaiah noticed a familiar face. Leah Parker sat in the flight attendant jump seat, having requested special assignment to this symbolic flight. She smiled warmly at Zion. "Good to see you again, under better circumstances." In the year since her whistleblowing had helped expose Coastal Airways' systematic issues, Leah had risen from reinstated flight attendant to key advisor on the company's reform initiatives. Her courage had earned her both professional advancement and personal satisfaction in seeing real change implemented. As Isaiah prepared to leave the aircraft, he hugged Zion tightly. "Your grandparents will be waiting in Nashville. I'll see you in 3 days." "I know, Dad," Zion replied with the hint of a preteen eye roll that suggested he was indeed recovering his normal childhood development despite the extraordinary year behind them. "I've got my phone, my emergency contacts, and my inhaler in the front pocket of my backpack." Isaiah smiled and gave his son one final hug before making his way to the exit. As he stepped off the plane, he found Michael Chen waiting in the jetway. "Mr. Johnson, there's someone who requested to speak with you before you leave." Isaiah followed Chen to a small private lounge near the gate, where, to his surprise, he found Amber Wilson waiting. The former flight attendant had undergone her own transformation over the past year. After her termination from Coastal Airways, she had initially fallen into bitter recrimination, but their meeting 6 months earlier seemed to have catalyzed a genuine change. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, rising as Isaiah entered. "I wanted to be here today, though. I understand why I couldn't be on the aircraft." Isaiah nodded, his expression neutral but not hostile. "What can I do for you, Miss Wilson?" "I wanted you to know that I've spent the past year working with an anti-racism education program in Denver public schools," she explained. "Using my experience, my failure, as a teaching tool for others. The program reaches over 5,000 students and teachers annually." Isaiah's expression softened slightly. "That's commendable." "I don't expect forgiveness," Amber continued, "but I wanted you to know that what happened changed me fundamentally. I had to confront biases I didn't even know I carried, and now I'm dedicated to helping others do the same before they cause harm." Isaiah considered her words carefully before responding. "Accountability isn't about punishment, Miss Wilson. It's about taking responsibility and working to ensure the harm doesn't repeat for anyone." "It sounds like you're doing that." Their conversation was brief but meaningful, representing the complex reality of human growth and reconciliation that rarely makes headlines but often constitutes the most significant form of change. As Isaiah left the airport, he called Zion's grandparents to confirm the flight details, then checked in with Vanessa Reynolds about the implementation timeline for the newly passed Airline Passengers Civil Rights Act. The legislation had passed with strong bipartisan support, creating industry-wide standards that extended far beyond Coastal Airways' voluntary reforms. Later that evening, in a quiet moment in his hotel room, Isaiah opened his laptop to check on the Johnson Foundation's latest initiatives. What had begun as a response to one incident had evolved into a nationwide advocacy organization supporting families facing discrimination in transportation contexts. The foundation provided legal assistance, advocacy training, and educational resources, with a particular focus on helping children understand and assert their rights. His phone buzzed with a text from Zion Plane taking off now. "Flight attendant super nice. Miss you already." Isaiah smiled, typing back, "Proud of you, son. Call when you land." As he set the phone down, his gaze fell on a framed photograph of Maria that traveled with him everywhere. "You would be amazed by him, love," he whispered. "He has your courage and your heart." The journey that had begun with terror and injustice had transformed into something neither Isaiah nor Zion could have imagined. A child's traumatic experience had catalyzed industry-wide reforms that would protect countless future passengers. A father's determination to seek justice had created systemic change rather than merely personal compensation. Most importantly, Zion had learned perhaps the most valuable lesson possible: that standing up against injustice, even when frightening and difficult, could create meaningful change in the world. 3 hours later, Isaiah's phone rang. Zion calling from Nashville after a smooth, uneventful flight, exactly the way air travel should be for everyone, regardless of age, race, or circumstance. "Dad, guess what?" Zion's excited voice came through the speaker. There was another kid traveling alone on the flight, a little girl who was really scared. I helped her understand how to use the call button and showed her my techniques for staying calm during turbulence. The flight attendant said I was a natural. Isaiah smiled, his heart full. That's what it's all about, son. Using our experience to help others. As the conversation continued, Isaiah reflected on the extraordinary journey they had traveled together. From a moment of crisis at 3,000 feet to congressional testimony and nationwide reforms, they had transformed trauma into purpose and pain into progress. The system wasn't perfect. No human system ever could be. But it was better, more just, and more accountable than it had been before. And perhaps that was the most important resolution of all. Not that every wrong was righted or every injustice erased, but that father and son had stood together for what was right, creating ripples of change that would continue long after their names faded from headlines. This story reveals powerful truths about confronting discrimination in America. First, real change often begins with a single brave stand. Isaiah and Zion could have accepted compensation and moved on, but they recognized their responsibility to fight for systemic transformation that would protect others. Second, accountability isn't about punishment. It's about acknowledging harm and creating meaningful change. Both Amber Wilson and Coastal Airways ultimately found redemption not through empty apologies, but through concrete actions that addressed root causes. Third, documentation is crucial. Without video evidence from multiple passengers, Zion's experience might have been dismissed or buried like countless others before it. In today's world, technology can be a powerful tool for justice when used responsibly. Most importantly, this story demonstrates that children deserve to be believed, respected, and protected regardless of their race. The adultification of Black children that causes them to be treated with suspicion rather than care remains a pervasive problem that demands our attention. Finally, true courage isn't fearlessness, it's taking action despite fear. As Zion learned, sometimes standing up for what's right means being uncomfortable. But it's how we create the world we wish to see. What's your takeaway from Isaiah and Zion's story? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had spoken up? Comment below with your thoughts or experiences. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful racism stories that illuminate important social issues. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Together, we can create a more just world for all children. Thank you for joining us on this journey of courage, accountability, and transformation.